human rights issues. Trump is also seeking China's support in reopening the Strait of Hormuz and addressing energy disruptions. The visit includes multiple meetings, official ceremonies, and a business delegation representing major U.S. industries. Both sides are expected to discuss economic cooperation and geopolitical tensions, with potential agreements involving large-scale Chinese purchases of American goods.
I have a great relationship with President Xi, and I think you can see that with the fact that in Hormuz, they get a big percentage, 40% of their oil from Hormuz. A discussion will be a little bit about energy and about the very beautiful country of Iran.
Former Ukrainian presidential chief of staff Andriy Yermak has come under suspicion in a corruption investigation involving a $10.5 million luxury real estate project near Kyiv. Anti-corruption agencies allege an organized group laundered funds through the development, though Yermak's lawyer denies any wrongdoing and claims the case is driven by public pressure. Yermak resigned in November amid earlier corruption allegations and has cooperated with investigators. The probe also involves other senior officials and business figures. The investigation highlights ongoing concerns about corruption in Ukraine, which remains a major obstacle to its ambitions of joining the European Union. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has refused to step down despite mounting internal opposition following poor election results. In a cabinet meeting and public remarks, he asserted his intention to remain in office and challenged critics to formally trigger a leadership contest. While dozens of Labour MPs have expressed dissent, no unified challenger has emerged, delaying any formal leadership vote. Starmer emphasized the need to continue governing and warned of instability if divisions persist. Potential successors are being discussed, but party divisions and political risk complicate efforts to replace him as Labour leader. Nigel Farage's Reform UK party has surged in popularity following strong local election results, winning more than 1,450 council seats and making gains across traditional Labour and Conservative areas. A new YouGov poll shows Reform at 28% support, leading rivals by 11 points, while Labour and the Conservatives trail behind. Approval of Prime Minister Keir Starmer's government has declined sharply with high disapproval ratings. Key voter concerns include the economy and immigration. Analysts say Reform's continued growth could reshape British politics ahead of the next general election. French farmers staged protests in Lyon over rising fuel costs, blocking roads and targeting a refinery to highlight economic pressures on the agricultural sector. Fuel prices for agricultural diesel have surged significantly in recent months, while farmers say their incomes have not kept pace. Protest leaders warn that high costs and competition from cheaper imports are threatening their livelihoods. The demonstration underscored farmers' ability to disrupt infrastructure and raised concerns about broader unrest. The issue is expected to play a role in the upcoming elections, with political figures proposing measures to reduce taxes and energy costs. CMS Administrator Dr. Mehmet Oz discussed the Trump administration's crackdown on alleged healthcare and government fraud on Jesse Watters' Primetime.
They're taking away your health. They're stealing from our most vulnerable in ways that are so reprehensible. I would have thought that alone would have been morally compelling enough to act. And here's the deal for anyone just worried about the money part of it. If we take the fraud out of Medicare, just Medicare alone, we would double the life expectancy of the Medicare Trust Fund, which means if you're working right now and you're worried about Medicare being there for you, or if you're on Medicare now and you're worried that it might have some financial issues, we would double its life expectancy if we just took the fraud out of the system.
This has been James O'Neill for The World Today. Now the protagonists.
With your help, we can continue to fight for freedom, reach new audiences, and bring important information to the public free of charge. This is not possible without your generosity. Join our quest for the truth and our freedom and donate today, telling it as it is. This is today's News Talk, The World Today.
And welcome to the Protagonists. Nice to have your company. I'm Mike Ryan. In 2026, the European Union faces critical challenges driven by deindustrialisation and economic decline of its member states, high cost of living and decades of mass immigration. Key issues include the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war and the cost of supporting Ukraine, the need to bolster defence and national security, its uncompetitive and US dependent energy supply, and European Commission governance and corruption. It seems as though the EU has failed in its mission to promote peace, economic prosperity, and stability in post-World War II Europe, and is now a corrupt, authoritarian machine at war with Europe's nations, identity, freedoms, and prosperity. While major reforms are focused on strengthening its geopolitical position, deepening integration, and preparing for future EU enlargement, major tensions remain on governance and issues such as replacing all sorts of things with qualified majority voting. Even more worrying and clearly endorsed by many of its members is the preoccupation with censorship, media management, and electoral influencing operations, signifying disregard for Western democratic values. Does the EU require a massive overhaul or even disbandment? How will the EU appear and function at the end of the decade? It's terrifying, isn't it? We're going to ask our experts on this, on how these things will work. Our panel today is two very, very good people. Dr. John Lachlan, Director of Forum for Democracy International, and Professor Emeritus Richard Sakwa. Thank you for joining me, gentlemen. John, can you just tell me your thoughts on the EU at the moment and where you see it in 10 years?
Well, I think you've summed it up pretty well, Mike. Irrelevance, weakness, corruption, failure of strategic thinking, all kinds of structural weaknesses. You mentioned the energy issue, which is obviously crucial, immigration, the list goes on. I think that these problems, which, as you can tell from the list, are very profound and are structural, endemic, they're also very deeply rooted. They've been really a problem for the last 3 decades, I would say, at least. The European Union in the last 3 decades has, to put it very bluntly, subjugated itself more and more to the United States. We've obviously seen this most recently in the Ukraine war, but when you go back to the beginning of the 1990s, it was essentially the same in the breakup of Yugoslavia, then in the attack on federal Yugoslavia in 1999, the attack on Libya in 2011. All these big events of the last 3 decades have been the consequence, direct or indirect, of the European Union's fundamental project of integration and its desire to to make itself into a geopolitical powerhouse, in quotes. In reality, of course, just into a vassal organization of the United States. I'm therefore extremely critical, as you can tell, and as people may know, of the European Union. But I would just add one thing, and that is that its weaknesses, which are very severe and, in my view, terminal, they don't only come out of Brussels. These weaknesses, we can observe them at the national level as well. All the national states, with very few exceptions, and the number of exceptions is in fact going down, suffer from a critical, chronic, managerial, and I would say narcissistic political culture in which everything is reduced to the level of spectacle. Everything is narrative control. Everything is image. And for reasons which I can only partly understand, our political systems systematically generate and bring up to power people who, and I'm sorry to be personal about them, but people who are autistic and narcissistic. I'm thinking of people like Sir Keir Starmer in the United Kingdom, Emmanuel Macron in France. I'm thinking of people like Mark Rutte, who was the Dutch Prime Minister for 16 years and is now the head of NATO. I'm thinking of Ursula von der Leyen, who is notoriously unsociable, and so on and so on. I'm sorry to make these personal remarks, but I am very struck by this extraordinary narcissism, this extraordinary autism, which seems to be structural, both at the European and at the national level, and which is one of the causes of this terrible drift away from reality away from strategic thinking, away from politics, towards, as I say, nothing but but narrative control. That's all Western European governments do. By the way, in my list, I forgot to mention the the biggest example of narcissism is, of course, Donald Trump. But we're not talking about the West in general, but Europe.
Yeah, we are. Richard, thank you for joining us. Can you just tell me where you see the EU in 10 years' time?
First of all, I'd just say that John has just made a fantastic analysis and list of the failings. Where it's going, we have to, may I just say a couple of seconds on where it's come from. My view, in addition to what John and what you said in your intro, is that the European Union from the beginning has been embedded in a larger political project, and that in part is an explanation for the pathologies which both of you have identified. And this larger political project is, well, I call it the political West. Others call it the collective West. The insiders like to call it the Atlantic community, the transatlantic alliance system. This was established in 1945. And with its ups and downs and massive evolution. But what I think a lot of people have failed to understand is that this political West, this collective West, the West, which of course claimed to have won the Cold War in 1989-91, is this collective West has a huge impact on the political culture and on the states themselves. The European Union is just one manifestation of it. The other one, of course, is NATO, and a whole stack of other whole cultural dimension of the way that it has changed the very nature of European statehood. Never before 1945 have there been these attempts to unite, which is fine, and obviously as long as it's focused on peace and development, which of course the European Union initially claimed it was. But we've seen state and cultural transformation, and this has led to this exhaustion and the inability for innovation and fertility and pluralism within the system itself. It isn't just simply the fact that the United States has dominated the European or Western Europe since 1945, which of course it has, but that we have seen the nature of the elites themselves have been transformed to such a degree. For example, in Germany, there was more pluralism in the system in the earlier years. For example, in Germany, you saw Ostpolitik, you saw German leaders taking a certain responsibility and facing down Washington when it came to energy, building pipelines, establishing a relationship with Russia, and so on. But ultimately, today we've come to a point at which, in Germany, for example, the Westbindung, this binding to the West, the whole identity of Germany has become skewed to an obsessional level. And, well, of course, the shock is that as the United States defects from the alliance system that it itself created, I mean, it's beginning, it's not going, we don't know what's going to happen to the future of NATO and this political West. So, in that context, the European Union is talking about becoming more geopolitical. But as it becomes more geopolitical, it becomes less true to what its founding ideals were. So it's a dilemma. It's a paradox. It repudiates its own essence. And of course, this leads on to all the pathologies which have just been identified. So what we see, possibly, is the development of the European Union as, if you like, a substitute West, a militant, it's, in other words, it wants to continue this project of 1945, this political West, to of hegemony, of dominance, and the whole pattern of political behavior in new forms. We see this, for example, in the discussions today on a multilateral financial framework, which from 2028 to 2034, that they want more majority voting, that the ability of the member states to stand up to, for example, resist sanctions is going to be limited. In other words, we're going to see a far more intense destruction of pluralism and of identity of the member states and the emergence of the European Union as a sort of a quasi-state defined by its hostility to Russia, defined by militarization, defined by intellectual exhaustion, which is going to lead to enormous amount of tensions. And indeed, is the question of its survival in its present form goes onto the agenda.
John, can you tell me if you think that the EU can be resuscitated or returned to its original aims? But does it want
No,
to?
because as Richard has just explained, the original aims are what it is now. It was originally created as a forward point in this new Atlantic architecture, which was set up after the Second World War. People perhaps don't appreciate the extent to which the Americans supported, they weren't the only people, they weren't the only factor, but their contribution to the creation of the original European institutions and indeed to their specifically supranational character was absolutely decisive. I'm talking about the role of the American government, the American Secretary of State in the late 1940s, early 1950s, when the first European community was created, which, by the way, was, of course, the time when NATO was created. So it was never, there is no golden age to go back to. The whole project was exactly what Richard Sackler has just described. It was an Atlantic project, an Atlanticist project. That's why, by the way, all the Atlanticist parties are pro-European, and the less Atlanticist parties, there aren't very many of them left anymore, are, let's say, slightly less pro-European. So, no, it can't ever go back to this original idea. I mean, yes, they talked about peace, that's true. But when you read the text closely, I'm talking about the original Schuman Declaration back in 1950, which created the first European community, the dedication to peace is in fact a veiled call for rearmament and for political, military and economic unification within the context of the then nascent Cold War. So even the peace ideology, which of course one would support normally, and which has been, by the way, cruelly abandoned in recent years, but even that was in fact a kind of trick, because the real goal was to fight the Cold War. And I suppose this brings me to agree also with Richard's second point. He referred to it glancingly, but I know that it's a big concern of his, as it is of mine, the issue of relations with Russia. We now see that the European Union's, I would say, only foreign policy, because it doesn't have any other significant foreign policies apart from its hostility to Russia. So obsessional has everything become. The only foreign policy is this determination to vilify Russia and to be on bad terms with Russia, and indeed to fight a war against Russia. This is profoundly un-European. Again, I'm not trying to make Europe into some great ideal, but objectively it is un-European. Russia is not only in Europe physically, geographically, it's on the European continent, it's not on the African continent, it's not on the American continent, it's on the European continent, it's the immediate neighbor of the European Union countries. It's not just on the European continent, even European Russia, leaving out Siberia, which is obviously colossal, even European Russia is, I believe, 42% of the European landmass. So how can you possibly have a European policy which is based on hostility to it? That can only do what Richard just said, which is lead to endless tensions. And those tensions, they have been simmering, they've now exploded in Europe, firstly in Yugoslavia and now in Ukraine, but also elsewhere in the Mediterranean area, in Libya and so on. They have been, these tensions are inherent in the whole centralizing project. You know, the history of Europe is, if you like, it's the history of Greece or Italy on a larger scale. Greece and Italy, they're ancient Greece and Renaissance Italy, indeed even pre-Renaissance Italy, they were based on areas of cultural, more or less homogeneity, but divided, of course, between different states who were in rivalry, competition, and sometimes hostility with each other. That's the European model. We come from Greece and Rome, if you like. We come from, that's where our cultural roots are. And that's what the European continent as a whole is and should be. In other words, yes, an area of cultural similarity, not homogeneity, but cultural similarity, but at the same time rivalry and competition. And of course, it's precisely that rivalry and competition which is stifled by the project of unification, the imperial project of unification, the imperial project of harmonization. And this is one of the reasons, probably the main reason, why Europe on the economic level is on such a downward spiral. precisely because the internal rivalry and competition, which is the essence of Europe and which helps other continents as well to prosper, has been stifled. If you look at the United States of America, we were talking about the collective West, but even within the collective West, the European part of it has declined catastrophically in the last 2 decades since the introduction of the single currency. If you look at the GDP figures for the United States and the GDP figures for Europe, the gap is widening. The American economy is getting bigger and bigger, and the gap between the American and European economy is declining. Why is that? Well, there are many factors, but one of them surely is the fact that the United States, in spite of its huge federal state, does remain a union of 50 different states, each with their own personality. Of course, not on the level of European nation states, but nonetheless, there is a strong competition, as everyone knows, between the various states of the American Union. And that element, that vibrant element of European culture, is precisely what is being, as I say, stifled by the managerial and imperial model that Europe has adopted.
Richard, by the way, you can both jump in whenever you want to. So I'm here pushing buttons furiously at the moment. Economist Richard Witter says the EU mirrors Soviet-style governance structures with an elected parliament that debates and approves laws, while real legislative power sits with the unelected European Commission. Richard, the European Commission leadership described glowingly as very poor or corrupt. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. What we're seeing, in a sense, is a type of silent coup exercised by the European Commission and its present leadership, Ursula von der Leyen, and the way that in her second term she has stuffed it with people of very low caliber, has been mentioned before. Obviously, the salient one is the Foreign Affairs Commissioner, Kaja Kallas. But it's been a power grab. The war, first of all, COVID, the pandemic from 2020, and then the Russia-Ukrainian war 2022. There's been a silent accumulation of power, which goes against the very, if you like, the statutes of the European Union itself. As always, a crisis is used for power maximization. This just raises the larger question, which has been alluded to in John's comments just now, that in the United States, federalism means devolution. It means giving a power to the states. In European parlance, for some strange reason, federalism takes on the opposite, and certainly in British discussions, the opposite, that it seems to be a federal superstate, as the Daily Mail and British media would put it. Whereas federalism can be a very powerful tool for allowing a dynamic relationship between the member states in our discussing European Union and the centre. The failure to achieve this balance has allowed now what is going to be a more and more, how can I put it, oppressive power of the European Commission, and indeed even marginalising the European Council, that is the leaders coming together to decide policy. So the way things are going, it's going to, well, just one other point is that it's quite clear that there's going to provoke a backlash. And that is how strong this backlash is going to be. But I mean, as we said, the sovereigntist parties. I know John has been very closely involved in that for many years. If you like, this quasi-Gaullist resistance to go back to that other debate, which was Europe of nation states, of union of patrie. So whether this European Union can become that, I'm not entirely sure. The problem is that it's caught between two dynamics at the moment. On the one side, within the European Union and in so many member states, we have the political void that what I've called and others have called democratism. We go through the motions, we have elections, we have manifestos, we have new leaders, and all the time the same policies emerge, the same constraints and limitations of within the Atlantic, the political West, the lack of political imagination, the lack of on the left, you have left populists on the one side and right populists who are trying to break this consensus. But both of them are subject to this enormous narrative control. And this is what I try to discuss in part in the book on the culture of the Second Cold War. So on the one side, you have democratism, which is, as I said, a guts democracy of its energy, of its vision for a future. And of course, Starmerism is a most perfect example of that outside the European Union today, but it's certainly symptomatic of a total emptiness, the void, a total void in political imagination and indeed in governance competence, where it's catastrophically incompetent, our leaders. And just in other words, the ability to deliver public goods and indeed to maintain infrastructure. We know in Germany, which always for us in the United Kingdom was a model of how you should run an effective state. Maybe you don't like it, but nevertheless, railways to run on time, efficient public services. And look at the decay which has happened over the recent years. And on the other side, the dangers of the opposition to it becoming so between democratism on the one side and illiberal democracy on the other, which undermines judicial freedom and all the other public goods, which I think most normal people would support, general constitutional liberties and freedoms, including the freedom of speech. So we have illiberal insurgencies on the one side and democratism on the other. And so the challenge today is to try to find a way in which we can reinvigorate the politics of the member states, and of course the United Kingdom is not one, of the member states of our European community outside the European Union or inside it, and to have an agenda for the next 10 years. Otherwise, the pathologies will only get worse. The militarism will become ever more dangerous. I mean, we are already the target of potential attack because the Russo-Ukrainian war is turning into a Russo-European war. And our leaders are dragging us into this without any public debate. And in fact, any attempts to try to withstand it, to oppose it, is criminalized even. We've seen this with the sanctions regime. So it's a very bleak outlook at the moment.
Yeah, John, I've just the EU. It's got this Russia. It's like, Russia, and now we see the Germany by 2039 they want to become the biggest, best, and most deadly blah 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 military in all of Europe. Does that sound alarm bells to you?
Well, yes and no. I mean, if you don't mind, I just want to carry on a thought that Richard has. I will answer that about Germany, but I don't want to lose the thread because Richard and indeed I have both in our discussions so far mentioned the United Kingdom. And of course, the United Kingdom is not a member of the European Union and has not been now for more than 5 years. And the fact that it is not a member of the European Union, but that it shows the same weaknesses, in fact, in some cases, probably even worse than the European Union, perhaps not worse than the European Union, but certainly as bad, is an indication of the thing I referred to in my first answer, which is that this is a much bigger problem than the simple Brussels institutions. It's a problem which concerns the member states of the European Union and non-member states like Britain. That problem can be described in different ways. Richard Sackville uses the word democratism. I use the word managerialism. What has happened in recent decades is that more and more areas of power, more and more competencies, more and more powers have been farmed out to independent organizations. So independent central banks, judicial control, obviously the European Union itself, NATO. NATO, by the way, we haven't said this yet, but NATO imposes, this is not widely known, imposes obligations on its member states which are secret. This was discovered recently. I work for a Dutch political party, and the Dutch MPs discovered this almost by accident when the Dutch health minister in the previous government said she couldn't do this or that reform because of NATO obligations. And they said, well, what are these NATO obligations? And the minister replied, well, I can't tell you because they're secret. So in the context of globalism, and by globalism I mean political globalism, more and more power has been farmed out to these independent bodies. And that means that when you get into power, if you get elected to a high office, you actually can't do anything. I met Liz Truss last year in Paris, the former British Prime Minister, and she said to me, and she said this in public, She said, I got to the top of politics, the top of the very summit of power in the United Kingdom, and when I got there, I realized I could not do anything. I could do nothing. And that problem, the fact that power, real power, as she also said in another very eloquent phrase, she said, you can get rid of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, but you can't get rid of the Governor of the Bank of England. So who is more powerful? That problem, which is a structural problem, and of course should give us concern for democracy, for democratic reasons, it also has a cultural consequence, which is, again, the one I referred to in my first answer, which is that the kind of people who prosper and can survive in such a system are profoundly conformist. They are profoundly, let me say, boring people. They're not people with a vision. They are people who, much like, I don't know, in some big company, rise to the top of some big company, not because they're good at making money, but because they're good at sucking up to their boss or whatever. This system of lack of power generates mediocrity. It promotes mediocrity. It cultivates mediocrity. And anybody who is not mediocre and conformist is spat out by the system. And therefore, we are in a downward spiral, which is a structural problem, as I say, of mediocrity. And you mentioned Richard Werner, Mike, in your question, the British-German economist, comparing the European Union to the Soviet Union. Many people have made this comparison, including many people who either lived in the Soviet Union. I've had conversations with people in Russia about this, or people who lived in the Warsaw Pact states, who say that it's in some ways exactly like it was in their early adulthood. But perhaps the thing which strikes me most, the similarity, leaving aside all the political science categories, you know, elections, democracy, accountability, all the sort of usual political science stuff, is the fact that the Soviet system, certainly in its later decades, specifically promoted mediocrity. That was exactly its hallmark. Leaving aside all the, as I say, the one-party rule, the totalitarianism, all the categories, it literally caused very mediocre people to rise to the top. And that is a problem which unfortunately cannot be undone until, as I say, this whole body, this whole straitjacket of institutions at both national and international, supranational level is unpicked. I'm sorry, I've given you rather a long answer to a question you didn't put, but if you want, we can talk about the Germany issue in a minute.
Yeah, actually, Richard, would you like to add to John's
Yes. The analogy with the Soviet Union is a powerful one, but let's also look at the economic level. You mentioned earlier the lack of competitiveness, and John is absolutely right that, 25, 30 years ago, the total GDP of European Union and United States were more or less level. Since then, the United States has gone forwards by at least more than 40%. Yeah. The problem, in part, is the stifling. How can I say? It's not just regulation, but the framework of economic development. What we've seen is that in the first 40 years after the end of the Second World War, we had this extraordinary social democratic movement, in part inspired by the competition with the Soviet Union to make the West look good in comparison with the public goods delivered by the Soviet system, however incompetently, however inefficiently they were there. And of course, already as the Soviet Union weakened from the mid-70s onwards, we've seen this neoliberal revolution in the West. And this neoliberal revolution, it's not just a question of mediocrity, which of course is definitely there, but the fact that the model of economic development is, we've talked, financialization, all sorts of other elements. In short, the European countries, community, by that I mean European Union and all the other non-EU states, that we're all suffering from a particular model of economic development, which simply does not deliver the goods for the people. And without, and this third phase, so you had this social democratic moment, you've had the neoliberal moment. Now we're seeing the emergence of tech giants. Some people call it techno-feudalism. But all of this is disempowering of the people, disempowering indeed of genuine of competitiveness and liveliness. In the United States, you still have it for various peculiar reasons, where it's become a whole new model in which as you say, the powerlessness of governance. Can I just add one thing on that? That, for example, we had in the United Kingdom the election in July 2024, a Labour Party elected with a huge majority. The problem is that even within this system, a leader with vision, a leader with a sense of programme, a sense of destiny, could take on, which Liz Truss, by the way, lacked all those elements, and indeed Keir Starmer and all our leaders for the last few years, has unable to change the framework of politics. But somebody could. And those who do challenge the system, for example, have in the United Kingdom Jeremy Corbyn, for example, they are, as you say, spat out by the system, destroyed, attacked, both consciously by political manoeuvring. We've seen, there's a whole stack of books which describe the way that this insurgency within the Labour Party was destroyed by various manipulations and accusations. So, in other words, there is always the perpetual danger that within this mediocrity, somebody will emerge to challenge that. And those challenges are constantly suppressed. And it is, therefore, the analogy like with the Soviet Union goes back. I mean, I've always argued that the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, August 1968, was the greatest self-invasion in history. Those attempts to achieve a socialism with a human face of dynamism, to make socialism a genuine popular project, a national project, as one. That is another analogy with the Soviet Union. Today, those sources of innovation, of energy, are systematically destroyed, and therefore dooms the systems to pathologies of decline and ultimately failure.
John, you were in the background nodding. Continue.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid I agree. I've now for many years said I'm not particularly optimistic, if that's the word, about the insurgent parties. I've seen these insurgent parties put more and more water in their wine, as we say in France. I'm thinking of the Rassemblement National in France, which doesn't want to leave the euro, doesn't want to leave the European Union, wants to reform the European Union, ha ha. And far from seeing any insurgency or any leader with vision emerging, Richard is, of course, totally right about Jeremy Corbyn. Far from that, on the contrary, we see, unfortunately, a system which still has a lot of life left in it. After all, it's just scored two very substantial victories in Bulgaria, where Bulgaria was brought into the Eurozone. So Bulgaria abandoned earlier this year its national currency, and the Eurozone has now increased by one country. And of course in Hungary, where there was a government in power. Okay, they had been in power for quite a long time, so perhaps it was time for them to go. But the fact that the Hungarian government the previous government is no longer in power is a very substantial victory for the European process, for the European project. And against these two victories, there is really very little to show for the visionaries or for the insurgents. And unfortunately, again, as with the Soviet analogy, I foresee instead a very long period of decline. We've already been in a period of decline for 2.5 decades at least. There's no reason why it shouldn't continue for another decade or so. Decline happens slowly. Europe has a lot of accumulated wealth. Well, France does, Britain does, Italy does. There's a lot of accumulated wealth, and that can keep people hanging on for a couple of generations. So although the signs of decline are already very visible, I don't think that we can confidently predict any kind of imminent change, unfortunately. On the contrary, I see a continuing slide for Europe, further and further, not least, by the way, accelerated by the fact, we haven't mentioned this yet, perhaps we should develop this point, by the fact that the United States under Trump, and who knows, maybe under his successor, is of course pursuing a policy of very aggressive hostility towards Europe. What I mean by that is obviously the sabotaging of the energy infrastructure in September 2022, the cutting off of Europe from Russian gas, which was the key, as everybody knows, to the German industrial project, which is now in free fall. That was an American project, and the Americans instead have forced us to buy their own more expensive energy. So our structural decline is now only going to be accelerated by this specific energy war, which started, by the way, also around the same time as the single currency. This started in the early 2000s with the discovering of fracking and with the emergence of the United States as a very major producer of gas. So I'm afraid I think the outlook is indeed grim.
Yeah, thanks for that wonderful news. I'm just thinking though, I'm going back to what I was saying before, and I'll just rephrase it. Can you tell me the obsession with Germany and with it has with Russia, and we'll go one step further, the obsession that the EU has with Russia. John, I'll stay with you for this moment.
Yeah, well, Germany has broken itself now twice. It broke itself twice in the 20th century on the Russia question, and it looks like it's going to do it again. I never tire of reminding everyone that the First and Second World Wars were Russo-German wars. The role played by the Western states, even Britain and so on, was in a sense peripheral to the central fact about those wars. And here we go again. And that's, by the way, why we see the re-emergence in the Baltic states, in Ukraine and so on, of these rather crazy neo-Nazi movements, because, of course, that dovetails with the overall geopolitical plan, which indeed is for Europe, which in the German mind is Greater Germany. I don't mean in an imperial sense, but what I'm in the Nazi sense or whatever. But instead, the Germans are convinced, and have been for a long time, that their model, their strictly speaking imperial model, in other words, where you have composite states within a larger unit, which of course is how Germany existed for 1,000 years, they believe that that model is the appropriate model for Europe. And they are, as we know from Ursula von der Leyen, from Chancellor Merz and so on, they are building their policy. They're trying to solidify their internal cohesion with this anti-Russia policy. People ask, is it frightening? Are the Germans going to put on their SS uniforms and start marching down the Champs-Élysées again? No, I don't think so. I think the danger is different. I don't think they will do that, because I think Germany is a very different country. It's a completely different country from what it was, I would say, in the first half of the 20th century. It's all the martial values, all the military virtues, if that's what they were, I would say, have been washed away out of Germany. I can't really see young German men signing up for to go and die on the Eastern Front anymore. That seems to me completely impossible. By the way, when the semi-conscription law was introduced earlier this year, and when it was discovered that you had to report to the German authorities before leaving the country for more than 3 months, even that threw up a counter-reaction, which caused that part of the law to be withdrawn. So no, I don't see that. Instead, what I see is something that I think Richard was referring to earlier when he talked about the financial model, which is that this money that's being created out of thin air, or rather in the form of debt, supposedly for Ukraine, the famous 90 billion, which has recently now been unblocked, is in fact, like everything else in our economy now, a boondoggle, whereby money is washed through. I'm deliberately quoting Julian Assange in this. He said this very brilliantly 10 or 15 years ago, is washed through the political system into the defense industry. So this is simply another way of extracting tax money to artificially to basically give money to the what few arms manufacturers we have in Europe, and no doubt most of them will be in America. When I say wash through, we know that this is the case because the British Prime Minister only last week, I think, said that he was interested in joining this 90 billion scheme, the European Union scheme, because it would help the British defence industry. So if we join it, then some of this money will go to British arms manufacturers. So we can see that that's what is involved here. The prosecution of the war on Ukraine is, yes, a geopolitical project against Russia. There's no doubt about that. But it is also, as I say, a boondoggle, as of course the American defense industry is, to force taxpayers' money, to force tax money into the military-industrial complex.
Richard, can you add to that, please? Your thoughts on Germany wanting to become the force by 2039. It does. It has received a fairly negative comment. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, a few things. First, the German question is back, but then you could say the German question never went away. At the time of the collapse, the end of the Cold War and the Berlin Wall, of course, Mrs. Thatcher and others were very dubious about even German unification in case there's great, huge power in the centre. And of course, the French have views on this because they've always considered themselves as the political leaders of the European project. The Germans can take a lead on the economic front. It's certainly back. But let me add and contextualize a little bit more to what's been said earlier, is that I still go back to our whole phase of history, European history since 1945. And this whole Atlantic community, the political West, collective West, has always walked on two legs. The one leg is precisely militarism, and as it very quickly degenerated, almost immediately, with Churchill's musings on Operation Unthinkable, that is, attacking the Soviet Union just as soon as they defeated Nazi Germany. And then by 1947, we were in the Greek Civil War, fully involved. In other words, the West, or the political West, the post-1945 West, has had this one leg, which is militarism with the money and the huge distortions which it has done in the United States, of course, as warned by Eisenhower in his farewell address in very early in 1961, as he left office, warning about the military-industrial complex and the revolving door between military officialdom, executives and governance, and so on and so forth. On the other side, this political West has had a Commonwealth dimension, that is, delivery of public goods and, under the rhetoric of freedom and political liberties. Unfortunately, in recent years, that the public goods side has become more and more, even after the end of the Cold War. And the astonishing thing is, after the end of the Cold War, this whole project of the West, it radicalized. It didn't end. It claimed to be universal. And this takes us to another, I think, a fundamental important point, is that this Atlantic community, this thing of which we're talking about this morning, is only one model of world order. It's a model of world order which claims, certainly after 1989 and the collapse of Soviet communism, it claims to be universal. It's claiming a universalism against what, in my view, is the genuine universalism of the Charter International System, established also in 1945 with the United Nations at its heart. And of course, the United Nations is symbolic because it then generated a whole stack of international law and norms which are genuinely universal. It's the only genuine source of multilateral sanctions, for example, which have been usurped by this political West. So when we're talking about the future of Europe, we should bear this dimension that there is something, many things outside of it. First of all, unfortunately, the United Nations system, the Charter system, is under unprecedented attack at the moment. The United Nations marginalized for various reasons, but above all, by the attempt almost of the Anglo-Saxon powers, and with France, in the United Nations Security Council.
We actually have a frozen. Everyone's disappearing me. Here we are. Sorry, we just lost you, Richard. Sorry, there was a disconnect.
Yes, I saw that glitch. Yes. And of course, you have other models of world order at the moment. Even as we speak, President Trump is going to China. And there is this alternative. There are, many alternative models of world order. So when people say today, the international system and so on, we have to be very clear that the international system is the one since 1945, based on the norms and the laws and the vision of a peace and development agenda of 1945. We've just had this most awful war, the worst in human history, and those aspirations still live on, by the way. And the European Union, its Atlantic West, has usurped them. It has distorted them. It has used them in the pursuit of a conflict which are totally unnecessary. The Russo-Ukrainian War, the most pointless war in history. Two great nations fighting and inspired to fight because of these crazy ideas that, Ukraine is defending civilization against Russia. Russia is one of the finest, greatest, most dynamic rich civilizations on planet, like China. And so we've got to be careful not to think in the categories of United States, American political science, which is based on the logic of conflict, based on the logic of lose-win situations. We don't have to buy into Chinese rhetoric, win-win situations and all that good stuff. But underlying it, there is an alternative vision of world order. Unfortunately, the European Union, and some of us, and I would admit to a certain naivety, in my early years, I supported the European Union though understanding, and I've always been ambivalent, but nevertheless, because I was more regardless. Yes, we in the United Kingdom, and I live in Kent, and this, for us, Calais is closer than London. And so therefore, links with the continent were essential, and they are to this day. How are we going to re-envision a European peace and development project? The European Union, as it now exists, is turning into a geopolitical project based on conflict and undermining the norms which were alleged, but we all know that in many ways based on a falsity, because it's been embedded in that Cold War project from the very beginning.
Thomas Farsi, German and European rearmament, in the context of a supposedly more European NATO, says it's not actually strengthening European autonomy, but further eroding it. Not only does it make Europe complicit in Washington's increasingly reckless military misadventures, as the Iran war would demonstrate, but more gravely, it's pushing the continent towards a potentially catastrophic confrontation with Russia. John?
Well, that's absolutely true. I mean, the confrontation with Russia long predates the Iran war. The subjugation of Europe to the American project long predates this. It was written into the Lisbon Treaty in 2009. So these things are long term. The whole notion of European autonomy, though, is an illusion. It's like everything else in the European discourse. It's based on illusion. There's no such thing as European autonomy. The European states have different geopolitical interests. They have different political cultures. They have different geographies, obviously. The notion of European autonomy is itself an illusion. Yes, there can be French autonomy, German autonomy, and so on, but European autonomy, no. It's not even a matter for debate. We know that in the deal signed in August last year in Donald Trump's golf course in Scotland, the European Union is obliged, or has agreed anyway, to buy hundreds of billions of euros worth of American military equipment. That's the wealth extraction which the United States is practicing on the European continent, both with the energy policy I referred to earlier and also with the military policy. So the whole notion of autonomy is an illusion, like everything else in the European project, like everything else. The whole thing is based on illusion. I mentioned narrative control. You perhaps you know this, but there are more people working in the communications department, or at least in communications in the European Parliament, than there are members of the European Parliament. There are just over 700 members of the European Parliament, and there are more than that working in communications. This is an extent, this figure, if you like, symbolizes the extent to which narrative control, and therefore the pursuit of illusion instead of the pursuit of reality, that's, I think, what Richard was referring to when he talked about social goods, that is the, if you like, metaphysical illness at the very heart of this whole problem. The whole thing is based on illusion. It's based on these notions, of course, of superiority, of universalism, of moral worth, of civilization, and so on. Richard, when you mentioned the Charter, the UN Charter, I'm sure you agree with me that yes, the vision, as you say, peace and development, it's wonderful in the opening articles of the UN Charter. But I'm sure you agree with me that the problem of our time is that we have forgotten the need for these things. Perhaps we are condemned as humans to forget them every 2 generations when our grandparents die, who can't tell us the stories. And then we're condemned to relearn them again. But an international system, by definition, can only work if people want it to work. There is no overarching system of coercion, thank goodness. And so international law can only be born, can only have any vitality when people see an interest in it. So if people start instead thinking that unilateral sanctions are the way forward and coercion and all the rest of it, and that is what will bring them benefits, then unfortunately the system will break down until such time as they relearn the lessons of the past. And once again, I think, unfortunately, we're a long way from that.
Richard.
Yeah, but I do agree with that completely. But one way in which you can actually have this buy-in, if you like, it coming from the global south, which,
Yes.
of course, lacks organization, lacks a lot of agencies. But one of the things we can say today is that while the EU and Europe declines, the rest of the world, the international systems, has matured. We now have 193 states, and we're seeing genuine activism. Brazil, South Africa vis-a-vis events in Palestine, a genuine independent action. At the same time, we see this Russo-Chinese alignment. It's not an alliance, though many people are saying it should be, given the craziness, this power-based politics emerging out from Washington today, which has more or less dropped the old-fashioned Commonwealth elements, the public goods side of the West, to focus just simply on a militaristic vision of establishing universal and perpetual US hegemony. That this alignment of Russia and China, I don't know, again, the lack of a word sometimes gives seeds the territory to your adversaries. But let's call it the political East for convenience. And this political East is based on a number of things, but one of them is commitment to the UN Charter and to make the United Nations Security Council work better. If you remember, Putin way back in 2020 suggested that the 5 powers, legacy powers, if you like, some of them, of 1945 should get together, and so on. There's a lot of initiatives, the Chinese, the 4 global initiatives which have been put forward by Beijing. In other words, while we have intellectual and political and indeed economic stagnation in Europe, the rest of the world is moving on. More than that, they're looking with contempt at what we have become. And so what at the back of this, we can say, well, how can we start re-envisioning a better West, a better Europe emerging out of this? A post-Western Europe even, I mean, defined as this political West, this terrible thing which since 1945 has stymied and stifled and limited us with all of those illusions to which John has alluded. The illusions and the falsities and the deceptions which really now erode and make us rotten intellectually and indeed civilizationally, and where the sources of renewal in this society are constantly suppressed. It's and John is absolutely right. The anti-disinformation industry is huge now, with all sorts of agencies. As soon as anybody challenges this NATO-ite militaristic agenda, for example, Nigel Farage, just before the July 2024 UK election, just gently questioned, is our policy towards Russia a sensible one? And the policy towards NATO. And he was absolutely hammered. And he hasn't dared to make a peep on these issues since then. And this is exactly a Soviet-type situation where the sources of renewal are systematically suppressed.
Just finally, as we have run out of time, I'm sitting here, I feel like I'm back at university. I'm enjoying this immensely. So thank you, John and Richard. Just quickly, final thoughts. Will the EU and NATO go to war with Russia, or is this just posturing? John?
Well, they are at war with Russia. They are, because there have been many attacks on Russian territory launched from Ukraine, but with American probably, but certainly Western logistical and possibly satellite guidance. So we are at war. I suppose the question is, will Russia's patience run out, and will Russia make good on its threats to launch attacks on European territory, for example, on military factories on European territory. The voices calling for that are pretty vocal in Russia. And there is surely a danger. I'm going to Russia next month. Maybe I'll get some sense of this, that, Putin will turn out to have been a moderating influence within the broader spectrum of Russian public opinion. But we are at war with Russia. We are co-belligerents. We are arming the Ukraine. We've had not just military trainees, but also, of course, intelligence and other logistics on Ukrainian territory now for more than a decade, at least since 2014. We are objectively in the normally understood terms of the laws of war. We are co-belligerents against Russia. We are currently, so far, Russia has not responded with attacks on European territory, but there have been Western, European, and American-backed attacks on Russian territory.
And Richard, you have the final say.
Yeah, well, I agree completely with what John has just said. We are at war, and now the question is how we can stop it. Because on the one side, as John says, that within Russia, the voices arguing that there has to be some sort of warning shot across the bows, hopefully not nuclear, but perhaps hypersonic, one form or another, to bring, as Sergei Karaganov, one of the leaders of the we need to respond now party within Russia, saying if we don't respond now, it's only going to get worse later, or exactly the dilemma of 1914 or whatever. If you don't act, if not now, when, which of course is a catastrophic dangerous. We are on the verge. We are in a Russo-European war. It's so far, it's a sort of a phony war, nothing phony about the substance, but in declaratory terms, it's a phony war. But we know that the phony war then turns into real war. And that's why discussion of this sort that we're having today, I think, is so important. It's just to warn and alert people to where we are today. And then hopefully we can avert the worst. In Russia, you say, as John says, the dam could well be bursting very soon. That it has been Putin who is accused of fighting this conflict with one hand tied behind the back. Now they're saying, let the dogs of war be unleashed. And that is the rhetoric increasingly heard in Moscow. But of course, it's been heard in the Western capitals for far too long.
I'm going to buy myself some alfoil, cover myself in it, and drink a bottle of whiskey if that happens. John, if somebody wants to find out more about you, how do they do that?
Well, thank you. I've got a Twitter feed, John_Laughland, Laughland, and I work for Forum for Democracy International, fvdinternational.com.
And Richard, how do they find more about you?
Well, I'm afraid I'm not very good. I'm not on social media. And so the University of Kent website, Department of Politics, I think is the best source.
Absolutely fantastic. Gentlemen, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for your input. This is The Protagonists. We'll be back tomorrow again, talking about all sorts of things. Maybe not the aluminium tin foil, in case there is a war. Just a bottle of scotch and kiss your ass goodbye is probably what is required. So that's it. Tomorrow we'll have more. This is The World Today, and this is The Protagonists.